store-bought tomatoes are just not as flavorful as homegrown. Part of the reason is that grocery store tomato varieties are bred for shipping longevity and packaging rather than flavor. But it could also be directly related to how the tomatoes are grown. So in this video, I'll share 3 scientifically proven gardening techniques to grow sweeter and more delicious tomatoes. Jumping right in with the first thing you can do to grow sweeter tomatoes, which is choose high sugar content varieties, namely cherry and grape tomatoes. The general rule is that smaller tomato varieties are sweeter tomatoes, and to measure sweetness we use something called the Brix rating, which is essentially just a measure of the sugar content in the tomato juices, or more accurately the dissolved solids in that liquid. So it's not necessarily all sugars, but there is a direct correlation between Brix and sweetness. So the higher the Brix number, the sweeter the tomato, and sometimes when you're shopping for tomato varieties, they will actually mention the Brix rating, usually if it's a particularly sweet variety. So for cherry tomatoes, usually the Brix will be somewhere between 6 and 10, which is very sweet. And for larger varieties like slicing tomatoes or big heirloom varieties, you'll be between 3 and 5 on the Brix scale. And if you grow a ton of tomatoes and you like to geek out, you can actually buy something called a refractometer and instantly read the Brix rating on your tomatoes. You just squeeze the juices right onto the refractometer and it will tell you the Brix rating of your tomatoes in real time. And it may be worth it to measure more than just sweetness. Like I said, you're measuring those dissolved solids, which can also be an indicator of the overall nutrition of your produce. But to me, I think the best way to tell whether your tomatoes are sweet or not is to just try them. But before you just go buying the highest Brix rated tomato out there, remember that flavor is a balance of sweetness and acidity in tomatoes. So I recommend buying a few different cherry or grape varieties and trying them out yourself to find out which one suits your preferences and strikes the perfect balance in your view. But a couple that we've tried that are both very sweet and super delicious. Sun Sugar is delicious. It's a small yellow cherry tomato. And then Supersweet 100, which is another hybrid variety that's very productive, a little bit bigger tomatoes as well, but still really sweet and delicious. Another thing you can do to get sweeter and more delicious tomatoes is fertilize appropriately once the plants start producing their fruits. Potassium becomes especially important as the plants start to go into fruit production mode. Nitrogen is still important, but potassium is actually used in greater quantity once the plants are producing. Potassium also plays a critical role in sugar production and transport throughout the plant, so you want to make sure that there is plenty of potassium in the soil. So once your plants are starting to produce their fruits, you want to make sure that the fertilizer you're using has plenty of potassium. A 1-to-1 ratio with nitrogen is fine, but even a little bit higher can be good. Or if you want, you can just use a potassium-specific fertilizer like potash and amend that into your soil. But above all here, I think it's important to just make sure to stick to some level of fertilizing or amendment regimen, especially as the plants are going into that production season, and you'll likely notice a big difference in flavor. And the third thing you can do for sweeter and more delicious tomatoes is harvest at the right time, and also make sure that you're treating the plants properly right before harvest. So research confirms that sugar content and sweetness actually starts to decrease after peak ripeness of your tomatoes, so you want to make sure to harvest them at peak ripeness or even a little bit before. There's something called the breaker stage in tomatoes, which I think is a little bit misunderstood. Basically what happens is once a tomato starts to turn like this one is here, it reaches what's called the breaker stage, where it starts cutting off ties with the rest of the plant. Now, I think what's commonly misunderstood is that the tomato does not completely cut off ties at this point. It's more of a slow and gradual process where the xylem and phloem, which are basically the tubes that connect the plant to the tomato, are starting to shrink in size, which essentially limits flow of water and nutrients to and from the tomatoes. However, once a tomato starts to ripen, this process has begun and it severely limits the amount of nutrients that can reach the tomato. And so the maximum flavor potential is pretty much reached at this point. So you can harvest whenever you want after this point, and there is some argument to harvest before it reaches full ripeness. You can see a lot of these tomatoes are fully ripe on this plant, but some of them are a little underripe. And the reason you might want to harvest early is, well, one, again, the flavor compounds are all going to be there. The tomato will continue ripening indoors, but also by getting the tomatoes off of the plant and indoors, you're getting them out of harm's way so that no pests can reach your tomatoes as they're reaching that peak sweetness. Lots of insects and animals will be interested in your tomatoes, so by bringing them indoors, you're bringing them to safety. Also, fully ripe tomatoes are very vulnerable to splitting. If there's a heavy downpour of rain or you water heavily, those tomatoes can split. Again, since water can still flow to the tomatoes, when it rains, it can swell the tomatoes and cause the skins to crack. And again, the max flavor potential is pretty much already there once the tomato begins to ripen, so there's really no risk of losing flavor by harvesting a bit early. And when you do bring them indoors to ripen, do not put them in the refrigerator. That will cause them to stay at that ripeness stage. Instead, leave them at room temperature until they reach a nice bright red color. One other thing you can do around harvesting is reduce watering before you harvest. Now, unfortunately, there's not much you can do about rainfall. We had a ton of rain recently, and I probably should have harvested these before. But the idea is that when it rains, the water reaching the fruits kind of waters down the flavors. And if you harvest before a rainfall or before you irrigate, those flavor compounds will be more concentrated in the fruits. So ideally, if you can control this, you would want to reduce watering by about 20 or 30% around when the fruits are maturing. So not when they're growing and still green. When they're getting close to that ripeness stage, you want to reduce watering before you harvest. I'm actually going to put this to the test because, like I said, it just rained a ton, and I did harvest some of the tomatoes from this plant before it rained, and so I want to do a little side-by-side comparison. Okay, so I've got the two tomatoes here. This one was harvested a couple of days ago before it rained, so this should be the more flavorful tomato, and this one I just picked off the plant. We had a ton of rain overnight, so this one should be a little more diluted and less flavorful. Let's find out. Gotta say, there's nothing wrong with that. That was a good tomato, but if this is better, hopefully I'll be able to tell a little bit of a difference here, but let's see. I'm glad I tested this. This tomato is noticeably worse. It could have just been an off tomato, but I'm pretty sure I harvested that from the exact same truss of tomatoes a couple days before it rained. Now it rained, and the one I tasted after it rained was sweeter and more delicious. So take this advice with a grain of salt. I think the more important reason to harvest before a rain would actually be to save the tomatoes from pest damage and all the other benefits that come with harvesting early. At least in this case, I don't think it had a noticeable effect on flavor. If anything, it was a little bit worse when the flavors were concentrated. So again, I'm not so sure on the efficacy of this technique. There are a few other important things you can do to maximize flavor, like growing in full sun. Make sure your plants are getting all the energy they need to produce, and also keeping them upright and off the ground so that they stay healthy, helping them to maximize overall plant function. I'll leave some links to articles that I used while researching for this video if you're interested in learning more, and I'll leave some links for specific tomato varieties that we've grown that are super sweet and delicious. Thanks so much for watching Geeky Greenhouse, and I'll see you soon.